is episode 63 of the Real World Wellness Podcast. Hi everyone, I'm Christine Lehman, a nutritional therapy practitioner and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. I help clients reverse diabetes naturally, lose weight, and lower their cholesterol. I also see clients by Skype. There are some great paleo and primal products on my podcast page, which you can check out on my website again at reversediabetescoach.com. Please remember while you're listening to the show, advice and information we provide is intended to be helpful and informative, but is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment. I am really pleased to introduce Maria Noël Groves, a registered clinical herbalist who runs Wintergreen Botanicals Herbal Clinic and Education Center, nestled in the pine forests of New Hampshire. Sounds lovely.
It is. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, you've been working with herbs for more than 2 decades, and you're certified by Michael Moore's Southwest School of Botanical Medicine and are a registered professional herbalist with the American Herbalist Guild, so I assume there's some distinction there.
Yes, there are. You don't need to have any sort of certification to practice herbalism in this country. It's not a licensed profession. But, for better or for worse, the closest thing we have to that is being a registered herbalist through the American Herbalist Guild. So while there are many excellent herbalists who choose not to get registered through the AHG, if you do find an herbalist who's a registered herbalist with the AHG, you know that they have a pretty high standard of education and have gone through a peer review process. So I'm really honored to have that.
Mm-hmm. And that's frankly how I found you.
Well, that's one of the benefits of having that.
Yes. And now you've also completed Rosemary Gladstar's Advanced Training Program and Linwood Herbal's Flower Essence Practitioner Training. And do you want to briefly explain what that is, those trainings?
Sure. Well, studying with Rosemary, I did both her beginner and her advanced programs, and I think that's sort of a requirement if you're in New England, as I'm in New Hampshire, and you're an herbalist, because she is the grandmother of herbalism, and she's in Vermont nearby. So that was a really great opportunity. And then a few years ago, I went through a flower essence certification training with Christine Tolt at Lycanwood Herbals, and that just kind of broadened my mind. Mostly I have kind of my feet on the ground, and I'm a somewhat sciencey or herbalist, but flower essences are a little bit more woo-woo. They're more working on energetic and vibrational medicine, but it was just a nice way to get my head out of a book and integrate with the plants in a different kind of way. So I really enjoy combining flower essences with my regular, more chemical herbal remedies.
So your business is devoted to education and empowerment via classes, health consults, and writing with the foundational belief that good health grows in nature. Now we're going to talk about your book today, which is called Body into Balance, an herbal guide to a holistic self-care. So how did you first become interested in herbs and their medicinal value?
Well, I think I was always interested in herbal medicine. I've always been a plant nature kind of kid. My mom is a nurse and is also interested in plant medicine, had a garden, kept herbs, and had a book called The Magic and Medicine of Plants by Reader's Digest. It was very popular at the time. And I just thought it was really neat that her plants had these cool special powers. I didn't really do anything with it. We didn't really use herbs a whole lot in our house growing up, but it was just sort of there in the background. And then when I was in college, I was en route to get my journalism degree and they need to write papers. I started writing papers on natural medicine and herbs and getting a few books. And then when I was in my sophomore year, I had a really stressful event and developed panic attacks and anxiety from that and some insomnia. And so that's what got me into an herb shop to buy herbs and start taking herbs for the first time. So the herbalist on staff there suggested valerian for sleep and kava for anxiety, which are kind of pretty common go-to herbs for that, and they helped a lot. And I did other work too, and that's something we talk about in the book. It's not just about take this herb and everything goes away. That's a very allopathic way of looking at plant medicine, but also looking at the root causes. I did a lot of personal work to overcome the insomnia and the anxiety, or at least manage it a lot better. But from that point on, I was hooked, and so I still did a lot of writing. I still do a lot of writing. I wrote the book most recently, but I also have been writing and freelancing for a variety of publications over the years, writing about herbs for the last 20 years, and also was an editor for Natural Health magazine outside of college, just after I got out.
Right, right. So you have obviously many interests, and I also like with the book that you talk about lifestyle and nutrition and take an integrative approach. So,
Exactly. You know, it's hard to talk about something like diabetes and just say, oh, take cinnamon, but not talk about the exercise and diet. You just can't really
right,
separate herbs from those other pieces.
exactly. And we're totally on the same page with that. So, why did you decide to write the book?
I wrote the book because my students kept telling me that they liked their class notes better than they liked their herb books, and eventually I got the hint. So I have a series that I've been running for about a little more than 10 years now called Home Herbalist Series, and it's evolved over the years, but we go through a body system. In each class, we go through a body system, and we make a remedy, and it's become really popular, and I've probably had thousands of people go through the program over the last couple of years. And I have very detailed class notes, and so that's what I had been writing, and I thought maybe at some point in time I might write a book, but wasn't quite sure that I was ready, and then one day it clicked that we could basically turn all those class notes into a book, and that there really wasn't much like that on the market that was organized by body system. So you learn, you know, instead of just being an A through Z herbal, each chapter goes through a body system or a health concern, and we cover that in depth, how things work, how things get out of balance, how to use herbs, diet, and lifestyle to bring it back into balance with recipes and charts and all that. And so I wrote it all fresh, so it's not just a compilation of the notes, but that was what inspired the book. And it's been really, a lot of people have given me the feedback since the book's come out that they're really excited to have it in their bookshelf because they don't have anything quite like it. And even though the information is very dense, the language is really easygoing. There are a lot of metaphors so that people can understand. It's organized kind of like anatomy and physiology textbook, but it's not, it doesn't read like a textbook at all. It reads like somebody is talking to you in a very casual manner.
Right, so it's in a conversational tone, and it's also it's what I would call, it's chunked into manageable pieces, and with lots of good headers. And so maybe you can just run through very briefly how you organize. You have 3 parts, right? Part 1, part 2, part 3. So
Yes.
what's the sort of the logic behind that?
So the first part is our foundations of good health, and so the opening chapter is not really so much about herbs, but just talking about basic needs. And I felt like I had to cover that in the beginning so that I didn't have to keep reiterating it throughout each chapter, although it still does get, discussed to some extent in each chapter because, like I said before, things like diet, stress management, your lifestyle, exercise, those things can make a tremendous impact on your health. So we start off with just the basics. Then we go into herbal nutrition and general nutrition. And so the herbal nutrition are things like nettles, stinging nettle for high calcium and minerals, things like rose hips for vitamin C and bioflavonoids, and how to make teas and how to integrate these very nutritious tonic herbs into your daily lifestyle so that you're getting a really good multivitamin buzz from those plants. Then we go into another foundational system for me. I think that a lot of health issues stem from stress. So we discuss the adrenal, the nervous and adrenal systems and stress, relaxation, mood, sleep, energy, and then go into digestion, elimination, detoxification. So those are the things that we cover in the foundation because those basic things tend to affect a lot of other health concerns. And if those aren't in place, if theirs aren't really feeling great and working well, then it's really common that we're going to run into a lot of issues. People just aren't going to feel well. And if you fix those things, if you get them running well, the people generally will feel pretty well. A lot of other health concerns might even just go away. And then part 2 is covering a lot of the other health concerns and body systems, so the immune system, respiratory system, blood sugar, cardiovascular health, memory and cognition and brain function, pain, thyroid health, skin and connective tissue, reproductive health, longevity and aging. And then I do have a chapter towards the end of that just talking a little bit about how to work with herbs with children as well as animals and expanding your herbal medicine for the whole family. And then there's a small part towards the end that's part 3, and that's on buying and making your own herbal remedies because there's a lot of good stuff out there and there's also a lot of bad stuff out there. And it's great if you can make your own remedies, and the book will teach you how to do that. But if you're just going to buy it, it also will guide you through how to make good decisions, so you're going to be less apt to get adulterated products and more apt to get things that are really well made and will work well.
Great. Well, I am really excited. Today we're going to just delve into the foundations, specifically the herbs, starting with, herbal nutrition. So we have time, I think, to do a little more of a deep dive into part one today, and then I would love to have you come back and we'll do a deeper dive into some of the other systems.
I'd love to come back later. So, yeah.
Great.
So what would you like to know about?
Right. So why don't we start with general well-being versus specific health conditions? And I think since we're talking more about general well-being today, why don't you just kick us off with a bit of a primer? What would you recommend? What types of herbs maybe and plants do you recommend for general well-being?
Well, it's always a little bit individual, so no one herb is going to work great for everybody. But general herbs that tend to work for a broad variety of people and do really well. From the nutrition standpoint, we have stinging nettles, and stinging nettles is one of our most nutrient-dense herbs. And as a culture, sometimes our diets aren't perfect, so we might be lacking on various nutrients, minerals, vitamins, things like that. And so stinging nettle is one of the things that can help fill in the gaps. It's particularly high in minerals like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and silica, so that makes it really helpful for hair, skin, nails, bones, also relaxing muscles through the magnesium content. It's one of our highest calcium-rich foods out there, as well as one of our most bioavailable sources of calcium. So it's particularly nice when we're looking at bone health, but it helps with other things too. No plant does just one thing, and so some of the other things that stinging nettle does is it is a diuretic, so it helps flush out the kidneys and improves detoxification that way. It also means that you're peeing a lot, so that can be a little bit annoying for some people. It depends. If you're somebody, like I am somebody who pees every 30 minutes anyway, practically, and so stinging nettle can sometimes be overdoes that a little bit. But for most people, it's a really nice plant. It also has an anti-histamine, anti-allergy effect.
Mm-hmm.
And
it reduces
for a wide variety of other things.
Yeah, I like that
So
it's anti-inflammatory as well.
Yes, it is a little bit anti-inflammatory. It's not, I wouldn't say that it's as anti-inflammatory as, say, turmeric, but it does have some anti-inflammatory properties, in part because it does stimulate detoxification, and it is nourishing the body, and those things alone will help support the body, so it's less of an inflammatory state. So nettle is a good basic one from the nutrition standpoint. Do you want me to give you a few other nutritives, or do you want me to jump into some of the stress supportive herbs?
No, let's go ahead and talk about tonics.
Okay. So tonics are a really broad class of herbs. So a tonic is basically any herb that is usually very safe, oftentimes sort of food-like, so you can consume it regularly, maybe even in really high doses, and it's very unlikely to cause any problems. And it generally has this nice supportive action that might be just supporting overall health, like a nutritious herb because it's giving basic nutrition will support overall health, or it might be targeting a specific body system, like hawthorn is a really classic tonic for the cardiovascular system. And we also have adaptogens, which are herbs that help the body adapt to stress, and nervines, and many of those could be considered tonics as well. So tonic is kind of a very broad class, and then nutritive is a specific type of tonic. So those are the plants that are just super nutritious and usually very safe and food-like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then why don't you go ahead and talk about other nutritive herbs?
Sure. So we have the stinging nettle. That one's a biggie. Another one that's sort of similar to stinging nettle is oat straw. And for that, we're using the tops maybe, but especially the green stems and sort of almost like the leaves or the blades. Oats are in the grain family, so they're kind of like a grass, basically. They're in the grass family. And so we're using those grassy parts when they're still green and happy, and they'll be dried and chopped up. And that makes a really nice tea. You could also throw it into your soup broth. You can't really eat it. Like stinging nettles, you could cook it and eat it like spinach. It does sting when it's fresh, but once it's cooked or pureed really well or frozen or dry, the stinging nettle loses its sting. Oat straw is, because it's a grass, we as humans don't have the gut to digest grasses. So you're usually going to strain oat straw out before you actually consume it. So you'll put it in tea, or you might simmer it in broth and then strain it out. And oat straw is also really high in minerals. It's a little bit higher in magnesium than the nettles, percentage-wise, than the nettles. It's also got a little bit of silica in it. It's high in calcium, but not quite as high in calcium as nettles. And it doesn't have as much of that diuretic effect. So if that was an annoying thing for somebody to be peeing all the time with nettles, oat straw is a lot less apt to do it. And it's a little bit more of a straightforward, nutritious plant. It's got a nice light flavor, sort of tastes like hay, because that's one of the things that we use as hay and straw. And it's easy to put into tea blends.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people really like that a lot. The only time that I consider oat to be inappropriate is if somebody has an oat allergy, which sometimes coincides with a gluten allergy. Oat straw usually isn't going to have gluten in it, but it has very similar constituents, especially in the grain. So sometimes, if you are allergic to oats, I probably wouldn't do oat straw, but for most other people, it's a really nice, nutritious herb that you can throw into your teas, or you could maybe take it as a capsule, but usually we're making teas or broths with it.
Right, and you have some great recipes here for nutritive, nettle oat chai, red tea, which is
you can really, those two herbs, stinging nettles and or oat straw, you can use those as a base in a lot of different tea blends because they have pretty mild flavors, so you can perk them up with other things like chai spices, which would be like cinnamon, cardamom, nutmeg, or you could do them with things like peppermint, so you can really change the flavor quite a bit depending upon what else you throw in with it. And you'll get the most nutrition if you do a really strong tea. So if you either simmer the tea, simmer your plant materials, you use a lot of plant material. So, usually when you make a cup of tea, you might just take a teaspoon to a tablespoon of herb and let it steep for a couple minutes. But if you really want to get the minerals out, they're a lot harder to pull out of a plant than some other constituents. So I might use a whole ounce by weight of these plants in 32 ounces of hot water and let them sit for 4 hours or overnight. So we call that a super infusion, coined by herbalist Susan Weed. And that really maximizes. So instead of maybe like 40 to 80 milligrams of calcium in a cup of nettle tea, you can get up to 500 milligrams of calcium in a cup of super infusion. So the more plant material we're using, the longer we're letting it steep or simmer, the better for getting those minerals out.
Mm-hmm.
And
now I'm just thinking,
in a lot of ways.
Right. I'm just thinking about, cold and flu season coming up here, and I'm reading about rose hips, which has a lot more vitamin C per ounce than almost any other natural source. So is that a good one for
Rose hips are a great one, yeah. The only downside to rose hips, and for vitamin C in general, it's very tricky. Minerals are really difficult to extract, but they're very long-lasting. You could have dried herb on the shelf for years, and the minerals are still going to be there. With vitamin C, it's a water-soluble vitamin, and that makes it very unstable. Once you dry something, and if you expose it to heat, those things are going to deplete the vitamin C over time. So even though rose hips are really high in vitamin C, you're going to lose about 90% of that vitamin C just on drying it. And then if it sits on the shelf for a while, which most of your herbs have been harvested at least a year or sometimes several years previously from when you buy them, you're probably not going to get a ton of vitamin C, even though if you've got fresh rose hips, they are incredibly rich in vitamin C. So you'll get some, maybe a buzz of vitamin C, and then you're going to get a lot of other bioflavonoids, and those will still be present. And the bioflavonoids help the vitamin C work more efficiently, and that can be a great way to support your immune system as well as connective tissue health and vitality.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite herbs is dandelion. I don't know if you're familiar with the coffee alternative dandy blend.
But, I am. That one's a really yummy one.
Yeah, so I have that every morning. And so I wonder if you can just talk about sort of the range of uses of dandelion and its different forms. Obviously, dandy blend is a powdered form.
Mm-hmm. So that one's processed in a specific way so that it will dissolve in water, so you don't have to steep it and strain it. You just stir it in and it mixes right in, which is really convenient.
Exactly.
But usually when we're using the crude herb, which is just the not so processed part of the plant, we'll use either the roots or the leaves, and they're similar but not identical. Both parts of the plant are really high in a variety of minerals, kind of like the nettle and the oat straw are. They do have some vitamins as well. There's some carotenoids, especially in the green leafy tops, because most of our green leafy things have a lot of carotenoids. And you also get quite a bit of magnesium, iron, those kinds of nutrients in both parts of the plant. And so the roots I really like as tea as well, and so you can have it raw or roasted. It's usually dry, but it can either just be dried as it is, or it might be toasted a little bit, as you might toast nuts, and that gives it a little bit more of a chocolatey coffee flavor. And then you can brew that as tea. Usually you simmer it, but sometimes you can get away with steeping it, and it gives you this coffee-like tea that has a pretty profound effect on liver and kidney detoxification. So really nice for getting the liver and the kidneys to excrete toxins more readily, and then they are also very nutritious at the same time. And the leaves and the root kind of do both things to some extent, but the leaves are more of a volume diuretic, so they basically make you pee a lot. The roots are not quite so strong of a diuretic, and they're more of a sodium leaching diuretic, so they pull the salt out, and then the water will follow.
Mm-hmm.
So
And it's also rich.
differences.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's also rich in potassium, right?
Oh, yes, definitely, really high. Most of our green leafy things are pretty high in potassium, and dandelion is nice because even though it's a diuretic, which sometimes makes you lose potassium, dandelion is also really rich in potassium, so it helps replace some of that potassium that you might be losing from the diuretic effect. And you can make tea with the leaves, but I don't like the type of bitter flavor that the leaves have in tea personally, but I love to use them as pesto. And there is a recipe in the book for that. You can also go online. It borrows from The Kitchen, which is an online blog, and they have one where they use dandelion leaves and toasted pumpkin seeds or pepitas, and those are kind of the basic ingredients, and then you use your other standard pesto things like garlic and olive oil, parmesan, lemon juice, and blend that all together, and it's really, really delicious. Whereas otherwise people might have a nibble of a dandelion leaf and be like, oh, I don't want to eat that. And then you dip the tortilla chip, an organic tortilla chip, into this blend, and you're like, wow, this is delicious. I could eat the whole bowl.
Right, exactly. Well, that's good to know, and that's partly why I guess I like my dandy blend, is because it almost reminds me a little bit of that kind of chicory coffee that you might get in New Orleans, if you've ever had that, because they use extracts as well. So
I haven't had that brand, but chicory and dandelion are really closely related. In fact, before they flower, they're really hard to identify one or the other, but they're very, very similar in their properties, both the leaves and the roots. And when we buy dandelion leaves in the grocery store in the produce department, it's usually a variety of chicory that they've grown. It's the same genus and species as their wild chicory, but they've tinkered with it a little bit so that it grows more like a dandelion leaf. But if you let that plant flower, you would see the blue chicory flowers as opposed to your yellow dandelion flowers. So when you buy dandelion leaves, it's usually not technically dandelion, but they're used the same. They have almost the same properties.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about stress. I think a lot of Americans and we have an international audience, it's probably a global problem. And you talk about managing stress with adaptogens. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, adaptogens are basically herbs that help the body adapt to stress. So they work very well on both the nervous system, helping to get our body out of the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state, and also, they don't necessarily put us in that relaxation response or that parasympathetic state, but they help us kind of stay sort of in between the two a little bit better without going into that full-fledged fight or flight. And then they also work on our endocrine system through our adrenals by helping to modulate how our stress hormones are produced. And they usually have a modulating effect, so it's not so much that they're just boosting those stress hormones or lowering those stress hormones, but helping so that you're producing a healthy amount of stress hormones as a general rule. And these are the herbs that we've revered mostly in other cultures. We tend to get them in the Indian medical system of Ayurveda and the traditional Chinese medicine system. For whatever reason, these plants are kind of absent in traditional Western medicine and Western herbal medicine. But they're revered for longevity tonics. A lot of them have libido benefits too, so libido is going to function better if our stress levels are better.
Right.
And they have longevity, vitality properties. So different cultures have had their adaptogens of choice, but the term adaptogen was coined by Russian researchers in the last 100 years or so. And some of my favorites for the stimulating ones that are a little bit more zippy, so for people who need that kick of energy, rhodiola would be a nice one that's really good, particularly for mental energy. It works a little bit for physical energy, but better for mental energy, cognition, It's a nerve tonic, and it tends to work very quickly. You don't really need a very high dose of it. You can take it daily, or you can take it just as needed. And then cotinopsis is sweet. Rhodiola is kind of funky tasting, so usually people take it as a capsule or a tincture. Cotinopsis is sometimes called poor man's ginseng or dangshen, and it's a little bit harder to find, but it's a root, and it's very sweet and nourishing and building, and it does have some zippy properties of ginseng, but it's a little bit more gentle. It's a different plant family altogether, but it has very similar constituents. Mm-hmm. And we can use it to boost our immune system and boost energy. Traditionally used in convalescence, that people are getting over deep fatigue of being ill. Sometimes it's used in Lyme disease as part of that protocol to kind of help people feel better and have less fatigue and help their immune system function better. So those are two favorites of mine from the zippy energy. Regular ginseng is also a classic. Eleuthero or Siberian ginseng is another one. And then I have some that are more balancing, and they're ones that are not quite so stimulating. Because sometimes if you have a lot of insomnia, or you're very agitated, or you tend towards mania or anxiety, those are times when the stimulating adaptogens might be a little bit irritating for those. So the balancing, calming adaptogens provide some deeper energy. They're not as strong and stimulating, but over time they build up, and so they tend to relieve anxiety as well as provide energy at the same time, which is kind of nice. So, we have sedatives, but if you take a sedative, then you might be a little bit sleepy during the day. These don't make you sleepy. So holy basil or tulsi is one of my favorites for that. Mm-hmm. It's also anti-inflammatory and also specifically helps modulate cortisol, which is one of our stress hormones, mm-hmm. but it also brings us into a little bit more of that relaxation response, and also helps with balancing blood sugar, which cortisol is responsible for that. So especially when people are having stress-related sugar cravings, I don't know if you know anybody who gets those. But that happens sometimes. So when you're under stress, your body thinks, give me fuel, because, I need this to fight or flight. So the holy basil helps bring down cortisol a little bit, so your body isn't trying to make or get sugar quite so readily, and can be really nice for that, and also a really lovely anti-inflammatory plant. So it's useful in pain protocols, even though it's not necessarily a star like turmeric or ginger might be. It also works on similar pain pathways as turmeric and ginger, and inhibiting COX-2, which is an enzyme that ignites inflammation in the body. And then ashwagandha is another favorite of mine that has a general, calming but energizing. Usually people will take it every day for maybe a year, and they say that doing that will give you the strength of a stallion for the next 10 years. And people tend to just feel more balanced, better mood, both, less anxiety, but also less depression, more happiness, better libido. It does boost the thyroid just a little bit, so it can be helpful in mild hypothyroid, and it might be inappropriate for some people who have hyperthyroid. And it does have some anti-inflammatory activities as well. So it's one that's really nice for a lot of people. The only people I would be a little bit cautious with ashwagandha would be if they're sensitive to nightshade family plants like tomatoes and potatoes, because ashwagandha is in the nightshade family. Mm-hmm. And also that thyroid, if people are hyperthyroid, I generally wouldn't use it. It might be okay, but I would be very cautious about it. So those are two of many of my favorite adaptogens.
Mm-hmm. Are there any adaptogens you recommend for people with celiac or a gluten sensitivity?
Well, any of them should be fine for somebody as far as not being contraindicated. None of the adaptogens that I know of have any relationship with gluten, and so they should be fine in that respect. As far as being beneficial for celiac, you might consider something like ashwagandha, which does have some autoimmune supportive benefits there, and celiac does have an autoimmune component to it.
Oh, yeah.
And then gotu kola is another adaptogen that's more subtle. I think it takes sometimes a couple weeks to a month or so before you really feel the effects. And it's most famous for, calm energy, relieving anxiety, and improving brain function. It's a very popular nootropic or smart drug herb. But it also has tremendous effects on improving healing of tissue, improving capillaries, the vessel health as well, improving collagen synthesis. And so consuming it as a tea in particular would be a great way of helping to heal the gut. And it's a lesser known way of working with gotu kola, but there has been some research on gotu kola for things like ulcers, and it does seem to have an affinity for the gut tissue. So it would, from that perspective of working with celiac disease, that might be helpful. And holy basil is another one because it decreases inflammation. might also be beneficial.
Right, and that is common. Even with type 2 diabetes, they have low-grade inflammation, and I also see clients with autoimmune conditions, and of course they have a lot of inflammation. So
yeah, inflammation. So, if you have celiac disease, you basically probably have leaky gut. So your immune system's freaking out, trying to attack everything that leaks out of the gut, and that's going to cause some inflammation. But also, if you're just under a lot of stress, when you're in that stress state and you have high cortisol levels, cortisol makes it so that your body can't down-regulate inflammation as efficiently. So it just kind of keeps ratcheting up. And with that cortisol being in high amounts in stress, it makes it harder for your body to bring it back down again. So just being in stress on a regular basis is going to, whether it's physical or emotional stress, is going to increase inflammation in the body. And then if you have a lot of sugar floating around, which also happens in stress and high cortisol, then that also aggravates inflammation throughout the body.
Mm-hmm. And you also briefly mentioned under the stress and jitters paragraphs that you can complement certain herbs with spices such as nutmeg. And I've certainly heard that cinnamon can help with blood sugar regulation as well. So so you can put those in your tea as well.
I love to use spices in my teas, and I also tincture them, so I make alcohol extracts of them. So tinctures are those little dropper bottles that you find in natural food stores, and they're usually alcohol-based. And alcohol does a great job at extracting spices. So I do keep a tincture of nutmeg and cardamom and cinnamon and even chocolate. I tincture, and I'll use those in very small amounts in a blend for a client, maybe anywhere from 1 to 5 or 15%. For things like nutmeg, I usually just use maybe 1% because it's pretty strong. But for something like cinnamon, I might boost it up a little bit more. And so I'll use it in my tincture blends, but then if you're adding it to teas, they're great at making them taste better. But spices also have a synergy effect, so they tend to improve the activity of whatever else you're throwing in with them. So they help improve digestion and circulation, and maybe have other effects as well. And but those things will help drive the herbs more efficiently throughout the body to do what they need to do. And then nutmeg has its own sort of anti-inflammatory, nervous system relaxing properties to it, and it tastes so nice. So nutmeg is one that I will classically add. If somebody had a lot of inflammation and blood sugar issues, then cinnamon would certainly be one that I would be considering adding in. If somebody had a lot of digestive sluggishness, I might throw cardamom into the mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. So let's talk about gentle, calming, and uplifting nervines.
Sure, so these are a nice extension from the adaptogens. And some of the adaptogens, those calm energy adaptogens that I mentioned, like the ashwagandha, gotu kola, and holy basil, are technically adaptogens and nervines, but some things are just nervines and some things are just adaptogens. So there's a little bit of a bridge here between those two categories of herbs. And when I use the term nervine, I mean herbs that are very nourishing to the nervous system. Oftentimes they have a little bit of a calming effect, but they're not usually sedating herbs. Those would be, I would consider those to be sedatives. Some people use the term nervine to refer to any herb that has any effect on the nervous system. So they might refer to coffee as a nervine and, super sedating herbs like valerian as a nervine. So, but when I'm using it, and I think when most herbalists use that term, we're referring to those nourishing, restorative type herbs. They usually benefit mood. They usually help the nervous system itself work more efficiently. They might be a tonic beyond your mood-based nervous system things, but also for other aspects of nerve function. And milky oat seed is one of my favorites for that. And that's the same plant as we use for oat straw, but we're focusing specifically on the tops. The grains, before they mature, they will ooze a little latex when you squeeze them. And when they're in that milky state, which is just for a couple of days, you would pull all those grains off. They're really fun and easy to harvest. Throw them in a blender with your alcohol to make your tincture and pour them up. That definitely helps extract them better. I learned that trick from herbalist Jim McDonald, and it is amazing how much better of an extract that makes. The downside with milky oat seed is it only really is effective when it's fresh. So drying it and using it for tea, you're going to get very little activity from the alkaloid that's in that milky latex. So you could do, usually it's as a tincture and a fresh plant tincture, or sometimes you might do it with vinegar. Vinegar should work pretty well. You could do glycerin too, and so those would be some alcohol-free alternatives. And milky oat seed is just really nice tonic for the nervous system. It takes a while to build up. It might, you might have to take it for a month or more before you start to really notice those effects, or you might notice that your mood is better. You just feel more balanced. Your libido might increase as well. Like I said before, if you're under a lot of stress, it's hard for your libido to function. So a lot of things that we use for stress and energy are good for libido. And it's also really nice for things like anxiety. And interestingly, it had a lot of traditional use in the last couple hundred years for addictions and helping people get over the withdrawal phase of various types of addictions, including tobacco and opiates.
Now,
I don't think it's going to make it like you didn't have any issues at all, but it does seem to be really supportive for that.
Right, and are you seeing that in the research?
There's a little bit of research, but it's more the traditional use. So it's more how doctors, a couple hundred, 100, 200 years ago, we had a lot of doctors who also used herbs, and it was one of the ways that those early doctors tended to use milky oat seeds. There is some research, but it's old research, and there's not a ton of actual clinical research on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I would love to see more natural options than just, drugs that are given to people.
Yeah, I think that we're going to be seeing more of that. I know, New Hampshire, we are, right at the center of the opioid crisis because our doctors were prescribing so many opioids, and so then the cartel started looking at New Hampshire and funneling more heroin into our area. So we have a huge problem with that in our state. And I know that a lot of our herbalists in our community are starting to meet and discuss how we can incorporate natural therapies in with it. Some of our opioid crisis centers have started to reach out to the herbalist and acupuncturist communities to see what other options are out there. Because some people don't want to go the drug route, but they definitely want to get off of these really nasty drugs. And, I don't know if there are a lot of great answers yet. There are some herbs that are supportive, but we're just kind of exploring that. So I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot more information, both research and probably also a lot more clinical experience coming out on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, St. John's wort is an herb that I think a lot of people have been, have heard about or more familiar with. Can you talk about the mechanism there and, how similar or dissimilar is it to, for example, the more standard SSRIs?
So it does seem to have SSRI-like activity, and SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what they'll do is when a neurotransmitter like serotonin jumps the synapse to have its activity, sometimes it is either, it's broken down in some way so that our neurotransmitters are made quickly, have their action very quickly, but also get broken down pretty quickly. And the reuptake inhibitors inhibit how those are reuptake or broken down, and so it leads to kind of a net increase in serotonin in the body. And St. John's wort does seem to have a very similar effect on that. May also boost dopamine a little bit, which some of the SSRIs do that as well, which can have a mood-boosting effect in somebody who maybe is a little bit lower on the serotonin side of things, and especially with long-term use. Like the SSRIs, it's not something that usually works right away. It's something that tends to work more over time using in pretty steady doses from a good quality product, and there are a lot of not-so-great quality products on the market. But it does also have just an affinity for the nerve in general, as a restorative for the nervous system in general, the myelin sheath, nerve transmission, nerve function. We know of it more commonly that way when we use it externally, like putting St. John's wort oil on sciatica to help ease nerve pain, or applying it topically after an accident to help bring nervous system function back. It takes a while for that to happen, but sometimes it can be really helpful. But you can use St. John's wort internally too. And I know that David Winston is an herbalist who will use St. John's wort in his protocol along with other herbs like bacopa and maybe some gotu kola and hawthorn to help heal the nervous system after trauma. Mm-hmm. So it has a lot of activity beyond this SSRI-like action. And, it's not an herb that works well for everybody, but it does work well for a lot of folks. And the biggest downside to St. John's wort, in my mind, is that it interacts with a lot of medications.
Yes.
Sometimes people who, could use St. John's wort benefit may be on other medications, and it doesn't interact with all medications, so you can double check it, but it does interact with a lot of things. So that might make it inappropriate to use internally. And there are, it isn't a plant that agrees with everybody. So occasionally somebody might find it actually agitates them instead of improves their mood, or maybe it might do some funky things with their thyroid. So,
and it can
so
also
you kind of have to listen to your body.
Right, absolutely. And I think the other caveat is not intended for major depression or clinical, deep.
Yeah, it's very similar in its activity, maybe a little bit gentler, but very similar in its activity to other SSRIs. And so none of those are really very effective for major depression. They did do some research recently on Prozac, which is sort of similar in its activity to St. John's wort, and they found that when you combined turmeric with Prozac, that the activity increased dramatically. So instead of being like 60-something percent success rate, it bumped it up to 80-something percent success rate by combining turmeric and Prozac. So I think there might be some interesting research that we could do on ourselves by combining turmeric and St. John's wort for major depression, and we might find that it acts a little bit better that way. And those both have much fewer side effects than the traditional SSRI drugs. And then we also want to look at other things, nutrition. There's a lot of research on nutrition and genetics and what's going on how our body deals with nutrition and mood. And then there's also exercise and therapy. And so there are a lot of things, especially when we're dealing with major depression, that we want to look at.
Absolutely. So the other one that caught my attention, and you're going to like this, but I like mimosas as a drink.
Totally unrelated, unfortunately. But,
so
mimosa. Now you're in the DC area. Are you familiar with the tree mimosa?
I probably have heard about it on one of my nature walks, because I do hike and walk in the area quite a bit, maybe in the Arboretum. But why don't you explain it to us?
Sure. So it's called mimosa is the common name, but the last name is albizia. That's the genus. And sometimes in a few companies, there are a couple companies that sell it, like Herb Farm and Planetary Formulas, and they sell it as albizia. So both terms can be used to refer to the plant, but if you're trying to buy it, you might find it more easily by looking for it under the name albizia. And so, but the mimosa, we're using the bark of this tree, and it's just a really beautiful tree. In traditional Chinese medicine, it's called the tree of collective happiness. And so our knowledge of it comes primarily from Chinese medicine and folks like Michael Tierra, who have brought it into common use in this country, but there's only a little bit of research on it, so it's still kind of new on that, but it's a really great mood booster. It's a nervous system tonic. It makes you happy, and it works more quickly than St. John's wort, and it tends to work for a broader range of people in my mind than St. John's wort. It's really good for people who are dealing with grief, depression, mood funks. It's also good for relieving anxiety. Some of the little bit of research that's been done has been showing that it has some anti-anxiety effects on a chemical level in the body. And when you're looking for it, so if you are in an area like the DC area where the plant grows, you'll look for this tree. It's a small, medium-sized tree. It's got a lot of thin branches that are very, very shapely to them. They kind of look like arms that are reaching in different directions. And these fern-like leaves are sometimes called related to sensitive plants. And so when you touch the leaves, they close up just a little bit. And the most striking thing is when they're in bloom, they have these pink powder puffs. They look almost like fiber optics, powder puff flowers. And you can use the flowers. The flowers smell really lovely, or you can prune the branches and then strip the bark off those branches. You wouldn't strip the bark off of a live tree. You'd want to prune the branches off and then strip the bark off. The bark is definitely a lot stronger than the flowers. And it's just a really nice herb. I use it mostly as a tincture, either the fresh bark or a freshly dried plant that then gets tincture. It does lose its potency after a while if it's been dried for a long time, especially the flowers will lose their potency. But it's a really nice one, and surprisingly, it's not used that often, but I think it's gaining a little bit more popularity as folks like Michael Tierra and David Winston are talking more about it, and I'm talking more about it. And it's just a really nice plant to consider. And it's abundant in certain areas of the United States, like the Bible Belt, DC area, kind of out, and then also in California, it grows pretty prolifically, like an invasive tree.
Well, that's great. I might be able to go out and find some. You also do caution, though, that women should not take it during pregnancy without supervision. Is that true of other herbs as well?
I'd say that's that's a general rule of thumb for pregnancy, and I don't personally specialize in caring for pregnant women, so I would usually refer to my resources, or oftentimes I'll send women to an herbalist or an naturopathic doctor in the area who specializes in that, like a midwife. But yeah, I would say that in general you want to be very cautious using herbs during pregnancy, mostly because we just don't know. There are some herbs like stinging nettle in modest quantities is usually fine during pregnancy. It's kind of like safer than spinach as a food. And, lemon balm might be okay in modest quantities. Raspberry leaf is okay in modest quantities. Ginger is okay in modest quantities. You may not want to be mega dosing and doing super infusions, but you could certainly do like regular teas of those plants, and that's usually fine. But in general, I would be cautious, and in pregnancy, try to use as little as possible. So if it was a question between using a drug or an herb, if you're working with a skilled herbalist, it might be safer to use an herb than a drug in a situation like that.
Yes. So let's talk about sleep and how to enhance sleep, because that's often a major, has major health benefits, as we know. It's very important for our hormonal health and blood sugar regulation. So what particular herbs have you found very useful in your clinical experience?
Sleep can be really tricky. There are a lot of herbs that help with sleep, and I find that part of it is finding the herb that matches really well with a person. And sometimes you can follow that by just looking at the literature and being like, okay, this one is for this particular stress type, or they're cold, or they're warm, or, but then part of it is just trial and error. So that'll point you in the right direction, but then you also just have to try it. Sometimes people don't always fit what's written in the literature and in the traditional uses. And then you also want to look at what's going on elsewhere. Are they looking at their cell phones? Do they have a lot of electronics in their room? Are they watching TV really late? Are they under a lot of stress? So it can be challenging to work with sleep. But that is one of the areas that I first got into herbs, and for some people the herbs work really, really well in and of themselves. And for some people it's more of just a training wheel to try to help get the body out of a particular pattern and into a new one. So valerian is the classic one, and that works really well for some people. It's a very tweaky herb in my mind for sleep, and by that I mean that it's really unpredictable, and it's not like it has a general activity that you can't expect the valerian to help everybody sleep. Some people will find that it makes them feel really sluggish and have weird dreams. Some people will find that it makes them agitated, like they just drunk a couple cups of coffee, which is really great if you have somebody who's trying to sleep. Now they feel agitated. So try out valerian, but don't be too disappointed if it doesn't work, because there are a lot of other options too. So valerian, I would tend to use that more for someone who has a lot of muscle tension. They're cold, cold hands and feet. They tend to be cold all the time, usually more anxiety, and usually it's less appropriate for somebody who runs hot, has a larger frame as opposed to being, more thin, and they might be more tending towards anger and frustration. I find generally speaking those people don't do as well with valerian as those other folks. And usually we'll do that as a fresh plant, fresh root tincture, and that's oftentimes the most effective way to tank St. John's wort. And then there are some other ones too. So California poppy, I would consider California poppy for folks who are having those spinning thoughts, people who are having a hard time staying asleep, like they might fall asleep and then they wake back up again later. California poppy can sometimes be really helpful for regulating those sleep cycles. And it is a mild opiate fuzz type plant. It's not addictive, and it's very safe for a lot of people, although I probably, just to be cautious, wouldn't use it in anybody who does have any prior history of opioid addiction, just to be safe. But generally speaking, it's safe for children. It's not addictive on its own at all. And we're using whole plant as a tincture or as a tea. I usually use the tincture. And it's really nice for those kinds of situations. It is a little bit of a pain reliever as well. California poppy has kind of a general pain relief activity, whereas valerian has more of a muscle relaxing pain reliever activity. And then we've got things like passion flower, which is just good for taking that spinning nervous energy and bringing it down quite a few notches. So it can be nice for that person who is too anxious and their brain is going a mile a minute, and that's why they can't fall asleep. And you'll want to play around with it too. Sometimes people find that when they're taking these sedative herbs, that some of them actually make them kind of depressed over time because they're over-depressing the nervous system. So that's something you're going to want to watch out for with any sleep herbs. Some people are more sensitive. Like I I react that way to skullcap, and it works great for sleep, but if I'm taking it on a regular basis, I'll start to get very, just very melancholy, and I don't normally have a tendency towards depression. That's not my thing. But skullcap is a bit of a nervine that's also, for some people, a pretty potent sedative for that overreactive nervous system, that every noise, every scent, every smell is bothering them, like the person next to you is breathing, and isn't that so annoying? Skullcap would be the herb of choice for that. And but like I said, you just want to be cautious that it doesn't over-depress anybody. So those would be some of the biggies. I do a sleep tea that's in the book, and it's just equal parts skullcap, passion flower, lemon balm, which we haven't talked about, but it's a little bit more of a lighter, calming herb. It's not quite so sedating. And then spearmint for flavor. And I'll add some honey to it. I'll do it really strong in a small teacup so that we don't want people getting up in the middle of the night to have to pee it out. So just strong and small, and it works really well for a lot of people. It's a pretty good sedating tea. And so you just have it right before you go to bed, and then brush your teeth and go to bed.
Mm-hmm. That sounds great. And that recipe is in your book?
It is in the book, yes.
Okay. Well, it seems that you're referring to tinctures, and I wanted to ask, are tinctures more herbal effective in terms of preparation, do you think, than capsules, for example?
In my mind, yes. I'm a fan of tinctures just because they extract the fresh or dry properties of plants really well. In most cases, if you're using capsules, they're going to be dry plants. And some of the herbs, like we've already discussed, milky, oatseed, and valerian, work much better fresh than they do dry. So if you just grind it up and put it in a capsule, it's going to be dry. So there's one disadvantage there. Also, tinctures are going to absorb very quickly into the bloodstream, and teas do a pretty good job with that too. And so with those, with a capsule, you have to digest it and break it down. So it takes longer for those herbs to hit your system, and if your digestive system isn't great, which is pretty common, then you may not get as much out of a capsule as you would out of a cup of tea or a tincture. And teas can be great as long as the herb is tasty enough that people are willing to take it. And the other trick for teas is they're also usually made with dry plants, so it's harder to make an effective tea from one of those plants that isn't good dry. And so, I don't usually do teas of California poppy and valerian. In some cases because they're better fresh, but also because they don't really taste very good once they're dry. Mm-hmm. But people might still use them and might still get good effects from them. I find that people generally respond better to teas and tinctures than they do with the capsules. But for some people, if that's more convenient for them, sometimes that works. There are some companies that do liquid capsules. Gaia is one of the good brands for those, and there are many good herbal companies out there. But they do a liquid extract, and then they put that in a capsule. So you still have to break down the capsule, but once your body gets the capsule open, the liquid that's in there absorbs very quickly, and those are alcohol-free too, which is nice for the folks who want to get the fresh plants and the fresh plant constituents, but they don't want to take a pill, or they don't want to take a tincture, and they don't want to have any alcohol.
Mm-hmm. So should people look at particular stores that might carry tinctures? Is there a particular brand? How should people go about that?
So there's a lot of quality variation on the market, and in the book I do give tips on how to buy herbs that are good quality. I would start by either buying herbs from an herbalist, from an herb shop or from an herb farm if they're making their own products, especially if they're making them with their own plants that they grow. That's awesome. And then beyond that, natural food stores are usually a great resource for good quality plants. They're generally a little bit more choosy about which companies they carry, and those would be like your natural food store co-ops and your family-run businesses. Whole Foods is decent, so you'll find some decent stuff there. And your other big chains might have them. I don't tend to go to the drugstores or Walmart or places like that. Will usually carry the lesser quality brand. So not to say that you couldn't get something that's good in those places, but it's usually not as good quality as some of the other sources. And I usually look for organic herbs because those herbs are usually better quality, and there's usually less likelihood that they've been adulterated if they're certified organic, and less chance that your picker who's been wildcrafting has harvested the wrong plant by accident or on purpose, because if it's organic, then it's actually been cultivated and grown as opposed to wildcrafted. So there's some ecological benefits there, but then also from a practical standpoint, they're usually better quality and more accurate in what they're supposed to be. And there's some companies that I really like. Gaia Herbs is one of the really excellent companies, and their products tend to be pretty potent. So I personally find that I get more of a response from Gaia than I might from other brands that are pretty common. Herb Farm is another really excellent company, and they have a very wide range of tinctures, and they do a lot in the herbal community, and most things are organic. Oregon's Wild Harvest is another really good company that sells dry herb capsules as well as tinctures, and they grow a lot of their things biodynamic and organic, which is really nice. Mountain Rose Herbs has online herbs. They sell some products. I mostly use their dry herbs, and they're really excellent for quality. They do identity and quality testing on everything, and almost everything is organic, and their prices are very reasonable. So they're good for dry herbs if you're making your own teas or remedies. So those are just a few. There are many others out there too. And like I said, if you have access to some that have been locally grown by your own organic herbalist farmer, then that's probably the best of all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm all for supporting the local farmers and gardeners in the area. And we do have some in this area as well, and probably many areas of the country. So
yeah, your ecosystem is pretty good. You can probably grow almost all the plants that we just discussed would be pretty easy to grow in the D.C., maybe not in the center of D.C., but in Maryland and Virginia, in that area, your climate is mild enough that you could grow quite a few of these herbs, if not all of them.
Right, and actually, even if you just have a small patio or porch, one of my neighbors had created her own little herb garden, just kind of using more a potted approach out on her porch. And they did quite well.
Yeah, they do. I'd say most of the things that we've discussed, as long as you have a good-sized pot, you could actually grow most of these things in a pot. The trees maybe might be a little bit trickier, like the mimosa, right. But you could certainly grow a lot of these plants. Like passion flower, I have in a pot right now, and I'm going to plant it outside, but it might die in the winter, so I might be taking this plant and keeping it outside in the summer and inside in the winter.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been really great, and I look forward to having you back on the show to talk about digestion and elimination and other parts of the body. But for now, where can people buy your book?
Well, you can get the book pretty much anywhere where books are sold. You can get my book, but I love it if people get their books through me, because that supports me a little bit more, and then you would get a signed copy. And you can do that through my website, which is wintergreenbotanicals.com. Or if you just Google Maria Herbalist New Hampshire, you'll find me pretty easily. And on there, you can buy the hard or the soft cover. It's pretty reasonably priced. Regularly, it's $24.95 for the soft cover or $34.95 for the hardcover, but right now I'm running a deal through the beginning of the year where if people want to get either of those, it's $5 off the suggested retail price. And you can also get it through all your usual places, and I do have links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and those types of resources as well on my webpage, so you'll get to see some excerpts and get a better feel for what the book is about. One thing we didn't say is it's a really beautifully laid out book. Working with Story Publishing meant that it was really easy to make a book that was affordable, but also loaded with pictures and beautiful illustrations and charts and things that really helps the information sink in a little bit more and makes it more enjoyable to look through the book.
Yes, I would totally echo that. I'm holding your book in my hand, and there are also beautiful illustrations of herbs as well.
Yes, yeah.
So it is really lovely, and I'm looking forward to reading more myself. And do you work with clients, Maria?
I do, yes.
And how can people reach you if they're interested in working with herbalists such as yourself?
So my website is a great place to find out more about me, and if you wanted to consider a consultation, I do offer distance consults as well as online classes, so those will be some things that your listeners might be interested in. And I also have a lot of just general information on my website, recipes, virtual herb blocks, links to good pages and places to buy herbs. So there's a lot of good information on my website, wintergreenbotanicals.com. Another good resource is the American Herbalist Guild website, and there you can find an herbalist that is very well trained, registered herbalist in different areas throughout the country. And like I said at the very beginning, it doesn't mean, just because somebody's not on that list doesn't mean that they're not a good herbalist, but generally if they are on the list, they're usually a very good herbalist and have gone through a peer review process to be on that list. So that's a great place to start as well if you're looking for an herbalist in your area.
Well, that's fantastic, and thank you so much for giving out those resources, and I will also include links to them in the show notes. So I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today, Maria.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lots of fun.
Absolutely. So next episodes, we'll be talking about food allergies, paleo comfort foods, and the holidays. So stay tuned, everyone, and have a great, healthy week.